All right. Hi there. Hello everyone. Thank you for joining DataCon LA 2020. Can you hear me?
Yes.
You're on. Okay. Thank you for joining and welcome to Data Infrastructure and Security track. And soon we'll be listening to AI and the Law section with Morvareed, Salehpour. I am Priya Chauhan, and your host, and our co-host today is Bob Newstat. We will be moderating the chat question and answer for you during this session. Morvareed is a managing partner at Salehpour Legal Counseling, a law firm specializing in handling contracts and tech transactions on behalf of clients. She has represented clients across the nation, ranging from entrepreneurs and small businesses to Fortune 500 companies. She works in a variety of industries, including technology, media, entertainment, among others. Ms. Salehpour is a graduate of UCLA School of Law, and she is also the president of the Santa Monica Bar Association, board member of UCLA Westside Alumni Network, and a regular speaker for tech and business law issues. Without further ado, I'll hand this over to the speaker. Thank you for being here today, Morvareed.
Great, thanks for having me. I'm gonna share my screen. All right. Well, it's nice to see you all. As Priya introduced me, I am a business and tech lawyer, and I work with entrepreneurs, startups, and other businesses and help them with negotiating and drafting all their contracts and tech transactions to best protect their interests and help them grow and generate revenue. I work with a lot of emerging tech companies as among my business. Today, we're going to be talking about some of the complications that come along with AI and the law and the implications there as well. All right. So the first thing we're going to talk about is the positives of AI. So there are several positive things that come with increased adoption of AI. One is there's increased automation of route and simple tasks, which create more efficiency and speed in transactions. There's replacement of human labor for physically intensive and dangerous tasks, which reduces injuries. There's more precision in medical treatments and procedures, which allows for longer and healthier lives. Widespread adoption of autonomous vehicles will dramatically transform the transportation industry and logistics industries that involve transportation. And we'll have basically, and we've already seen this, a redefining of roles in the workplace and society as for industrial revolution technologies such as AI become more widely adopted and instituted. At the same time, there's challenges that come along with use of AI, and in particular, increased use of AI. And so one of those is, of course, social and ethical considerations that are involved with it, economic impacts that are originating from greater use of AI, intellectual property issues that are involved with AI, privacy issues that arise from a lot of use cases of AI, and liability issues. So those kind of change and get new complications there as well. And we're going to talk about each of these in detail. So the first issue is the social and ethical considerations. So use of the, for example, one of the areas that AI will come in is this use of facial ID. And the way that the tech currently exists, there are high error rates with respect to identification of minorities and women, and makes it problematic from a social and ethical consideration viewpoint. Additionally, there's implicit biases built in to these any of these kind of AI, not just limited to the facial recognition software, but just AI in general, right? There's both the biases of the developers themselves that is being worked in, as well as the biases that's contained in the data that's used to train the AI. So a lot of that, is often unintentional. because, for example, with the data, like if you're having some kind of, say you're applying AI to some kind of criminal justice application. Well, the criminal justice itself is biased and has problems. So once you're taking the data from that, it works in those biases, and it's not, I think sometimes people assume because it's technology, it's AI that's, providing recommendations, for example, or identification or something, it is going to be neutral. But that's not true, because if the data itself is bad, it's biased that's being fed in, that means it's now being perpetuated by the algorithm, and in many people's eyes maybe giving a false kind of sense of correctness or neutrality to it, when it shouldn't be. With it should still be understood that there's bias built in. So that is another issue. And then another kind of social ethical consideration here is there is increased autonomous weapons, and this could lead to a worldwide kind of autonomous weapons race, especially as there are countries like Russia who are actively seeking to be a leader in the space. The other kind of complication here is there's continuing to be increased misinformation through bots, which is, we've already seen this, it's been going on for a while. We saw it kind of on a bigger scale in 2016 with Brexit and the US election. There's political and social manipulation that's occurring through use of bots, and that's continuing to happen right now. And this is something that, we need to start to be more cognizant of and see how this kind of affects, us on a social and ethical scale. In addition to those kind of considerations, there's economic considerations and complications that go into with use of AI. So AI is continuing to grow, and it's expected that the growth of it in the next few decades is going to be exponential. So we're going to see continued job loss from AI, which significantly outpaces jobs that are being created. And our governments aren't very prepared to deal with that. We're kind of seeing that right now with what's going on with COVID, and it actually gives us an opportunity right now, because there is, a greater number of unemployment, to actually explore some ways to be able to address this both now and in the future with this, these kind of mass unemployment that's going to happen with this growth of this fourth industrial revolution technology. And something I think we're even seeing at an increased rate now, since a lot of workplaces and are transitioning to remote and trying to find different ways to cut costs. So some of the measures that our governments need to kind of start considering are, do we need UBI? Do we need universal healthcare? How do we make the transition period between now and the mass like what happens after the mass adoption, a lot easier on people? We then have intellectual property considerations that go into use of AI. And this comes in a variety of ways. So, for example, one of the ways it comes in is that with any kind of artificial intelligence platforms or services, there are traditional intellectual property rights that apply. And it's important for companies in the space to have well-drafted agreements in place to protect their intellectual properties in all their transactions. So this includes, having very clear agreements with employees, consultants, with vendors, with customers, with terms of service. All of those agreements have to be very carefully drafted to particularly address intellectual property and to particularly address data. Those are two big issues in the kind of AI analytics SaaS space. And if you do not address those properly in your agreements, you could be giving away rights that you shouldn't be giving away, taking on liabilities that you should not have, and having those improper agreements there in terms of intellectual property and liabilities. It could result in a situation where you, as a business, the business is, one, taking on too much liability that could put it out of business, and two, actually giving away more rights than it should, and made its business not basically invaluable. As any kind of tech business, the most valuable asset is intellectual property. So if you're having weak agreements around your intellectual property and you're not adequately protecting it, and even potentially giving something away that you didn't mean to give away because you didn't have the right language in your agreement, well, now you've created a situation where you don't actually own that intellectual property anymore, And that's problematic for your ability to continue to monetize that and grow. So it's, again, very important to have well-drafted agreements, all of this, when you're dealing in these kind of high-tech industries. In addition to those kind of traditional issues surrounding intellectual property that exists, there are there's a new frontier of artificial intelligence created inventions. So for example, think of this as AI generated music and AI generated code. And this is something we are already seeing and we will continue to see moving forward. And it creates interesting issues about, well, where does the ownership lie for some kind of, product that has, or creative offering that has been basically created by AI unilaterally. And the important kind of consideration there is that, this is a new kind of venture area that no one, we don't have established, case law on this, but we're going to see this continue to develop and issues arise toward regarding this. And this ties into not only ownership of intellectual property and its monetization, but also into liability. So if something does go wrong with this kind of AI generated, code, for example, who's liable? For what, it ultimately like makes sense for whoever owns it, whoever created the AI that then generated the further code. It makes sense for them to be the owner. And that's what, we've seen some holdings from some, like there was someone who had he had created an AI that generated some code, and he had tried to argue to some intellectual property office that, the AI kind of owned itself. And they disagreed with them and, said, no, the IP will ultimately be held in your name. So that kind of makes sense. While we haven't necessarily seen cases on this yet to clearly establish case law, that kind of line of reasoning does make sense, because ultimately you need some legal entity to be both, owner and more importantly, responsible for things that go wrong. So it's not surprising to continue to see development there around, well, it's ultimately a certain legal entity that owns whatever that's been created by the AI, since the AI is not a legal entity itself. We then have the situation where we see AI potentially being used for IP administration. And this is a very complicated issue because intellectual property is global. The laws are not uniform. They're very jurisdictional. So that means intellectual property laws in the US are different from another country. And, there's often, there's some, you have to register it in different countries depending on what you want to do. So that makes it very difficult to kind of create some kind of easy uniform set of, algorithms that can kind of execute this. So that's something that I think potentially could develop down the line, but it's definitely needs a lot more advancement given the complications there. And the other kind of interesting complication from intellectual property and artificial intelligence is the issue of infringement. So again, this is operating autonomously. And in many situations, because it's operating autonomously, it could potentially do some act where it's engaged in, for example, copyright infringement. Again, there's going to have to be some entity that's liable for that, right? Because there is, the artificial intelligence doesn't hold assets. It's not a legal entity. You can't really sue it. So it creates a kind of a new world where a business could potentially be liable for infringement that's taken, that's conducted by an algorithm. It's kind of released out there to do a certain action for it, and it ended up infringing. So it's a new potential kind of scope of liability to consider for businesses as they move forward in this area. The other issue that's related to all of this is privacy. So this comes in with a lot of artificial intelligence because there's data that's used into it, and a lot of it's an analytics based. So there are a lot of privacy issues because you're dealing with data. More and more data is fed into AI platforms and algorithms every day. And ownership of that data is very important. So that is just one of the issues. So if any business that is in the space of artificial intelligence, analytics, all of this needs to be very careful that data rights are being appropriately negotiated in all their transactions, particularly since AI is adaptive. So if you don't have rights to, use the data that you have got access to, well, then it kind of prevents you from being adaptive, which is the key feature of artificial intelligence. So again, agreements with wherever you're getting your data, whether that be your customers or other sources, they need to be very clear and well drafted in regards to data. In addition, there are privacy issues the privacy kind of laws and considerations that go into there. So you not only have to comply with various laws depending on what you're doing and where you're based. So for example, the EU's GDPR, California's Consumer Privacy Act, high tech and HIPAA, if you're in the med tech space. You also have to comply with, whatever requirements, a customer, for example, may have or want, and you have to come to some balance. Again, the agreement's important there because you'll have to come to some balance to what you can kind of take on and what you can't take on, what is required by law, what is excessive from what's required from the law that the customer is asking and you have to push back on. So again, these agreements are very agreements relating to these privacy issues for your transactions are very important, because if you don't negotiate it properly, you will end up taking on a lot broader liabilities than you may be legally required to do, and actually, that is a threat to the viability of your business if the liabilities are higher than expected. And privacy liabilities are often very, very high because there's so much data at issue, and there can be data breaches and data violations, and there's fines involved with a lot of that, as well as potential lawsuits. In addition, with privacy, we have several kind of general kind of issues that we are seeing with interacting with AI. So there is decreasing individual privacy. The AI is analyzing individual online behavior. It's revealing political beliefs, religious affiliation, race, ethnicity, health conditions, gender, sexual orientation. Even if you haven't necessarily directly revealed that information, it's able to kind of create that information from your searches, everything you're kind of doing online. Increasing use of Internet of Things devices have kind of accelerate this and make this more of a problem, because there are multiple devices and locations that data can be collected on someone, right? They have Alexa, they have a smartwatch, they have a smart appliances, they have their phone, the computer. So there's so many different areas that information can be collected, and so many different types of data that can be collected. And this all results in kind of compromises of privacy. So we have data exploitation when people are, and I think this is the general public, the masses of people are generally unaware of how much data that is being generated, processed, or shared from what they're doing. So they don't necessarily realize that all these devices they're using is actually generating and collecting data on them and then sharing it. There is identification and tracking issues. So again, even when you are using these multiple devices over various locations, even when it's anonymized, there are artificial intelligence that can de-anonymize the personal data and re-identify it from all these different locations and match up the data. So that is a thing that's continued to be a problem. We also have the issue about as the technology evolves more and more, there are becoming new ways to kind of circumvent established legal procedure. So I kind of like using the example of voice and face recognition. When you kind of say you go to border patrol, customs, and they want you to unlock your phone. Well, they can't force you to actually put your finger down and unlock it. But with some of these voice and facial recognition, they don't actually need that kind of consent from you to do it. They can just kind of hold it up to your face and it could unlock and things like that. So it actually makes it a lot easier for them to get into devices without consent. There's then kind of prediction, again, going to that kind of manipulation. There's a lot of prediction data out there, and activity data, location logs, and other metrics are used to kind of reveal emotions and belief, and are actually being used by certain kind of persons and businesses to manipulate people's thoughts and beliefs, and they're not really cognizant of that yet, and we don't really have necessarily clear regulation around all that yet. And part of the problem there is that our legislators are not very tech forward, don't understand tech, and so they haven't really made an effort to kind of address some of these issues. And for example, it shouldn't be a question that media laws apply to social media, since most people actually get their news from there, but that hasn't even been clarified yet. We also have the issue of kind of profiling that goes along with this increased use of these kind of technologies. So we have like unconsented characterizing of individuals with potentially no ability to change the outcome. So that can limit access to credit, employment, housing, etc. And this is kind of what you can think of like China's social credit system. So this is something that we should we will continue to see as this technology is adopted, and things we need to consider, like how do we best address what that means if someone is automatically characterized into a certain category. So data is in general the most valuable resource. It's like oil, and it's continuing to be monetized by companies. So we basically have to figure out, well, how does this work for consumers? And legislators have to get, as this continues to increase, they have to get more knowledgeable about this and pass more I wouldn't say really, I don't think privacy is ever going to come back, or maybe more like privacy rights, so that, or not so much privacy, so data rights, that consumers maybe have rights in the data that they're sharing. And we're starting to see more of that. We're seeing California's had the new law, Illinois has a state law on privacy. There's been an effort and a kind of federal law that that didn't get passed, but I think we will continue to see more privacy-based laws pass, and that'll just be a continuing challenge for businesses in the space, but also, expected, given that there are these new issues that are kind of being created with adoption of all this tech. The other kind of issue arising, from all of this is kind of liability. Who's responsible for the damages or the losses caused by an error, artificial intelligence error? So traditionally, liability would be to the human operator, right? But when something is self-executing, the code itself, as we discussed earlier, can't be liable, and there must be some legal entity that must be liable. But there is some ambiguity in the line of causation and fault potentially. And there's question is the developer, the software provider liable? Is the manufacturer liable? Is the smart device owner liable? So this becomes a complicated issue where there might be multiple potential parties at issue. And when you are dealing with a gray area, when we start to get more case law on this, I would expect everyone involved in kind of like the chain to be brought to court and sued, and have let the judge kind of start to flesh out some of this. But I think we'll go through some examples here. So whenever you're choosing, for example, an algorithm, there's always company profit and revenue considerations that go in, as well as consumer expectations of performance and safety. So there's a couple specific examples of all of this. So one is, there's been a couple laws that have been put forward, so they haven't passed, they're like bills that have been put forward in various countries, including the US and Australia, for fines or criminalization of controversial content being spread on social media. So this kind of arose initially after there was the shooting in New Zealand, and algorithms, for example, on Facebook specifically, weren't picking up the videos, the horrible videos that were being put up quick enough. So some of them were getting through. So these bills tried to say that if your algorithm isn't strong enough, if material is getting through, this hateful content that shouldn't be there is getting through, we're going to criminalize it, this for the tech executives. So the tech executives themselves are beginning to be subject to both fines and jail time. Well, putting such a high barrier, particularly the jail time, on tech executive personally, that creates a situation where the tech executives are going to make decisions about, for example, what is free speech, and they're going to be overly restrictive. And that is not a situation we should be in. It should be, the government should find, some balance that makes sense about, what is what degree of something, what kind of materials can be shared or non-shared and all that. But it shouldn't be a situation where we're saying, you know what, Zuckerberg, you get to make the decision about what's free speech, and he's going to make it based on his self-interest of not wanting to go to jail, so it's going to be overly restrictive. So that's one of those situations where it's a new complication, but it doesn't make sense to kind of criminalize it to the level of allowing one person to be the decision maker on a social issue such as free speech. Another example here is autonomous vehicles. So there's an AI-driven decision-making process with all of this. And one of the issues that'll come in is, even though it's supposed to be this, maybe, try to say a neutral algorithm, well, in a way it can't necessarily be, because how do you make company profit revenue for any kind of car company if you are not able to tell your purchaser that their safety is going to be prioritized over, someone on the street, like a pedestrian or someone else? So that kind of will come into a lot of this too. Like, how does that, just the profit revenue consideration come in? Like, what about consumers' expectations? No one's going to necessarily, like, people want to, buy a safe car. So, these are interesting kind of issues there. And then there's kind of individual reliance on situations where somebody kind of relied on an algorithm to make a decision. So, for example, there are, algorithms that make recommendations for specific decision making in, for example, in the medical context and things like that. But what if the recommendation was wrong? Well, how does the liability there get determined? Is it the people who actually provided the services, the algorithm that made the decision making? Is it for example, the doctor that relied on the decision making? These are interesting kind of issues, and I think part of the consideration here will also come into, like, how reasonable was that reliance, right? Was it a strong algorithm? Was it based on legitimate how good was the data that it was relied on? So these analyses will get really fact dependent, and we'll kind of go down deep into the details. So it's very important to be kind of considering these, like, how strong is the algorithm, what the data, the strength of all these, as well as keeping records of all these, so that if an issue does arise, there are records to establish that whatever the business, the individual was doing, it was based on reasonableness. It wasn't something that a reasonable person would not have relied on such a recommendation, for example. All of this, the social issues, the privacy issues, the IP issues, data issues, liability issues, these are all basically creating new complications and implications for businesses in this space, for any of this emerging thing. So what is really important is that there's forethought is important to address all of this. There is potential ambiguities, and you have to actually set up these strong agreements, these strong business procedures and policies to address the ambiguity on the front end. So if you do end up in a dispute, in an agreement, or any issue down the road, you have a strong argument for what the outcome should be. So now I will take some questions. Does anyone have any questions?
Oh, hi, this is Bob Newstead. I think I don't see any questions in WOVA, but from what, thank you so much for all this great information. I think what you're saying a lot will play out in the coming years, and there'll be a lot of lawsuits. But but you brought up a lot of good points on privacy and who will be responsible for the AI decisions that I haven't thought of. So what we see now is companies being, Facebook and Google being sued by the government for not doing things they should be. Someone thinks they should be doing. So do you just see that as a beginning of a long court proceeding?
Well, so I think there's a couple of different issues. The DOJ sued Google this week for antitrust issues, but it's actually very interesting because it's very rushed. Like there may be potential issues there, but they need to be fleshed out, and they haven't really been fleshed out. It's I think it's partly political motivated. The filing has been, this week, right before the election, only Republican attorney generals kind of signed on to the action right now. So, and the administration has allowed other mergers in the space, like basically have continued to allow consolidation in the space. So T-Mobile and Sprint just consolidated and merged in September and they were approved. So there was no, we don't have a lot of cell providers. So why is that okay, but Google? And so I think part of it is they're actually trying to further a narrative that, social media is unfair to conservatives, for example. So we need to kind of be cognizant about, these government officials don't actually understand what's going on. And some of this is political in terms of what they're starting to do and trying to, fight or regulate these entities. And I think what we need to think about is we need to start putting in people into office who either understand what tech innovation is and the challenges that we kind of like just discussed that are involved in this and how to be forefront of all that, or at least at the very minimum are willing to bring in the different experts to talk about all of this. And you need various experts. It's not just, the tech people, because these are very complicated issues and it requires a multidisciplinary approach. So you need the tech people, you need the lawyers like myself, you need social and ethical kind of specialists. You need all these people to come into a room, talk about the various complications on different levels, and come up with new kind of regulation or legislation that makes sense in light of what is going on. And unfortunately, our country hasn't come to a point where it's being able to do that. And I think because of that, that we are kind of behind on being able to move forward effectively with innovation, right? For example, China is much more forward than us in tech adoption and, for example, in digitizing payment processing. We are so behind. We still have communities that are very based in cash, and we have credit cards, right? They've kind of moved on to everything's through WeChat or something. So it's kind of interesting to see these processes moving forward. And it's interesting that some of the tech companies are trying to do it, which is also worrisome. Like I don't necessarily want Facebook doing Facebook being the one who's going to have the global currency, because they have no social ethical, again, responsibility. Their responsibility is to their shareholders. Oh, there's one question I see on here. Let's see. Okay, so the question is, outside US, privacy law has some consideration for consumer data processing and AI, and US is now catching up. What factors affect the slow adoption of privacy law across the US? Oh, so I think one of the problems with the US is, again, what we were just talking about. It's not as the masses aren't as forward thinking on terms of tech innovation and tech problems. I mean, we're actually seeing more increased innovation now from COVID forcing people to go home and work remotely. So that's the problem. And California is always kind of on the leading front range of very different regulations. And so because California has pushed this now, I think more states are going to be following in line to this. So I think our trend has started to kind of head towards that, but we are unfortunately, again, our government in DC and you know, a lot of states is just not knowledgeable about tech, and that's creating a lot of these issues. All right, any other questions? Oh, let's see, a few questions. Let's see, yes, I can share links here to, yeah, you can reach me at the addresses on my, on the slide, as well as I'll share it in this room. And let's see, outside, we talked about that one.
I would just like to say that you're a superstar, and we had issues setting this up right now. So you're the first one of the day for me. Thank you.
No problem. Next question is, how can customers protect or consumers protect themselves from organizations implementing invasive AI? Well, it's important as a consumer to actually understand the data that's being kind of gathered from you and make a decision about whether you want to share particular data. And I think the interesting thing, for example, is that Apple recently has announced with the iOS 14, they're going to give people the option to opt in for ad tracking. And Zuckerberg has actually kind of pushed back and really had like, you know, freaked out about this because it's going to cut back his funds for Facebook. But that is something you can do. So like now that's helping you get the knowledge. You now know, oh, well, it's going to be tracking me. Like, I don't want to be tracked necessarily. But I think the assumption is if you're using something, the data is being generated and gathered on you. So think about, well, whether you want to share that data. And one thing, for example, is I know a lot of people who've used Ancestry and 23andMe and shared their genetic data. Well, that's something I personally would never want to do, right? I don't want to give them my genetic data. I don't want them, and then they sell it and people don't realize that they're selling this data. So consider that, you know, assume that these companies, they're really all data companies. They're all data mining. And that's why I call this data like oil, because all these companies are mining the data and then they're selling it. And even MoviePass, if you guys were familiar with that, that was when MoviePass did. It was really a data company. It was purely taking the data and selling it. So you need to be cognizant and understand that, you know, nothing is really free. You're giving them your data. And so be comfortable with actually sharing data when you use an app or a website or all of that. How do you see WeChat user versus government case? Okay, so I mean, a couple of things. I think in WeChat particularly, I think in China is a very more authoritarian government. So I think they're all kind of related. So we don't want it like to be that. But I think if we're going to digitize something, for example, it's better for in a democracy to have the government involved, because the government does, you know, technically we vote for our legislators. They have some responsibilities to social society, to constituents, things like that. So there's some way to like actually supposedly have control over them. With you have a private entity like say Facebook doing it, we don't. Shareholders are potentially the only people who have control over that. So it's always going to be, the decision making is always going to be how do we make the most money? And that is kind of what you've seen with kind of Uber, where they've, you know, there was the whole issues with employee misclassification. They treat their, you know, the people who drive for them very badly. And they actually, you know, there's been allegations that they've used algorithms that make these people break even at best. So that's the kind of the difference. Where you have a government use case, you at least are supposed to have some accountability. With a private corporation or business, you don't have accountability to consumers. Okay, and then I think there was a question at the top I missed. Let's see, please comment on we've talked about the prospects of national privacy law. So that's something I think we'll probably get in the future. But again, I think it starts with states and with, you know, with California. All right, let me see. Anything else that there seems one more. I think that was it. Oh no, wait. If someone in the legal industry wants to pursue this merger, what steps could they take into this new space, and how can consumers protect themselves from organizations? Okay, we answered protect themselves from organizations. Great. I think that's it then. Well, I enjoyed joining you guys, and please, yeah, reach out to me connect with me on LinkedIn, or reach out to me via my website or at my email, which is my first initial last name at salehpour.com.
I am your biggest fan.
Thank you, Priya. All right. Well, bye everyone. Good seeing you.
Take care. Have a beautiful day.
Bye.